We'll start with the basics. In this module, we'll look at everything you need to know about permissions in Confluence. That way, we'll all have a level grounding in the subject area and we can respond to the configuration and troubleshooting use cases that are presented in the other modules of this course. When we talk about the basics of permissions in Confluence, we're talking about global permissions, space permissions, and content level restrictions. Let's define briefly. Global permissions in Confluence are system-wide. They grant individual and group access to Confluence at the global level, including the permission to create personal or general spaces, to use administrative features, etc. There are also options for anonymous access. Space-level permissions are managed on a space-by-space basis. They grant space access to users, individuals, and anonymous users, and control what they can do within the space. At the content level, the visibility and editability of pages and blog posts can be restricted to specific users and groups. So let's look at each of these areas in more detail. Users need to be granted a global permission to access Confluence in any useful way. Here are the Confluence global permissions. They relate to administrative access, end-user access, space creation, and the ability to see user profiles. Global permissions in Confluence are quite different to global permissions in Jira, because in Confluence, you can grant global permissions to groups and individuals. Here, we have the View Global Permissions Administration screen, where global permissions are managed. You can see that groups, individuals, and anonymous users can be granted global permissions. In this Confluence instance, you can see the two default groups that are created when you install Confluence: Confluence administrators and Confluence users. We'll discuss these more shortly. You can also see that an individual user is granted all of the global permissions. You should be aware that it is more efficient to grant global permissions to users via their group membership rather than managing permissions on an individual basis. The administration overhead of managing users' access on an individual basis is significant. As a point of best practice, unless you need to manage permissions on a per-user basis, you should add users to groups and manage their global permissions that way. Let's look at the two default user groups that are automatically added when you install Confluence. It's important to understand their use. First, the Confluence Administrators group. When Confluence is installed, the person who sets up the instance will determine the initial membership of this group. It's a super user group. So, when a user has membership in this group, they can perform all the administrative functions of Confluence. They can also access all content regardless of space permissions and regardless of any content restrictions that are added to pages or blog posts. Even if a user has both the Confluence Administrator global permissions, that is, Confluence Administrator and System Administrator, they will not have the same level of access to Confluence as members of this exclusive and powerful Confluence Administrators group. It's that special. Two very useful facts relating to this group are that you are not able to edit the global permissions that are granted to this group, and you cannot delete this group. Even if you wanted to, Confluence will not let you. Now, let's look at the Confluence Users group. It's created when Confluence is installed. When users are added to Confluence, either via invitation or by self-sign-up, they are automatically given access to this group. It makes sense that the group should not be deleted. Unlike the previous group, Confluence Administrators, it is possible to delete this group, but you shouldn't do so, or else you can no longer add users to Confluence. If you don't want to use it, just revoke the Confluence users can use global permission, then manage access via granting the can use global permission to other groups or users. Let's look at the can use global permission. The can use global permission is the permission that everyone needs in order to access Confluence in any useful way. Users with this permission count towards your license count. An important point to note is that when a user is granted the can use global permission, it doesn't mean that they will be able to access content in Confluence. They will only be able to access content in spaces where they have the space permissions necessary to do so. If a user has the can use global permission, they will be able to see all the users in the Confluence instance. They can view user profiles and they can view users via the people directory. Here we have Steve, who has been added to Confluence, but he has not been granted the can use global permission as an individual or as a member of a group. What happens in this case? Without the can use global permission, users will be able to log into Confluence, but they will not be able to see any of the Confluence content or view any of the users in the instance. So the important point here is that apart from being able to log in, users will not be able to access Confluence in any useful way unless they have the can use permission. Without the can use permission, users do not count towards your license count. The view user's profile permission is relevant only to anonymous users. Recall that if you have the can use permission, by default, you'll be able to interact with other users, be able to see their profiles, and access the people directory. But many organizations which allow anonymous access to Confluence do not want anonymous users to do so. With this view user profiles permission, organizations can allow anonymous access and then either limit or allow their interaction with other users. Let's see this in the configuration panel. If we grant can use to anonymous users, that means that they can access Confluence without using up a license seat, and they do not need to log in. These anonymous users will not be able to access content in spaces unless they are granted the permission to do so on a space-by-space basis. You cannot grant anonymous access to a space via space permissions without granting anonymous users the can use global permission. Anonymous users then also need the view user profiles permission in order to view other users in this Confluence instance, view all users via the people directory, and view other users' profiles. With this permission, anonymous users will be able to @mention all users that have been invited or added to the Confluence instance. Without this permission, anonymous users can only @mention the user who created the page that they are commenting or editing. Next, we'll look at the space-related global permissions. They're easy to understand and allow users to do exactly what you might expect. If a user is granted the Create Spaces global permission, they will unsurprisingly be able to create spaces. If they don't have the Create Spaces permission, guess what? No space creation for them. The same thing goes for the Personal Space global permission. If users have it, they can see the Create a Personal Space link and create their own personal space. And the last two global permissions are System Administrator and Confluence Administrator. There is often some confusion around the differences between them and between these two permissions and membership in the Confluence Administrators group. So let's clear that up here. Recall the supergroup Confluence Administrators. Members of this group are granted both System Administrator and Confluence Administrator global permissions, and that can't be changed. Then, on top of that, membership in the Confluence Administrators group grants special privileges. They can access all content regardless of space admin permissions or content level restrictions. Even if a user was granted both of these global permissions, they would not have the same level of access to content and functionality that a member of the Confluence Administrators group has. Let's look at an illustration. We already covered the supergroup Confluence Administrators. On the right here, you can see that Amanda is a member of that group. As a member of the Confluence Administrators group, she is automatically granted both System Administrator and Confluence Administrator global permissions, and that's fixed. It can't be changed. Not only are the permissions not editable, we also are unable to delete the Confluence Administrators group. On top of that, membership in the Confluence Administrators group gives Amanda special privileges. She can access all content, regardless of space permissions or content level restrictions. If we haven't made this completely clear already, it must be stressed that membership in the Confluence Administrators Group is not the same as being granted all of the administrative global permissions. Here on the left, you can see that we have created a group named Administrators and granted that group all administrative permissions. Ian is a member of that group. As a member of that group, Ian has all the global permissions. Who has more access, Amanda or Ian? Amanda has more access than Ian because she's a member of the special and powerful Confluence Administrators Group. Amanda can access all content, whereas Ian's access to any content is still subject to space permissions and content level restrictions. Don't forget, though, that Ian could easily become a super user and member of the Confluence Administrators Group. How? Well, as a member of the Administrators Group, and thus having both Systems Administrator and Confluence Administrator global permissions, he could add himself to the Confluence Administrators Group. It's important to note that if he was not granted System Administrator global permission, he could not do this. Now that we're clear on how the Confluence Administrators Group works, let's look at the difference between the two administrative global permissions, System Administrator and Confluence Administrator. Users with the Confluence Administrator global permission have limited administrative access. Users who have the System Administrator global permission can perform all Confluence administrative functions. There's a long list of tasks that users with only Confluence Administrator global permission cannot perform. These tasks are generally ones that have the potential of compromising the security of the Confluence instance or impacting Confluence functionality. They cannot, for example, configure the server base URL, allow public signup, install plugins, or manage daily backups, and many other functions which are too numerous to list here. The bottom line is that if you are unable to perform one of the expected administration tasks, it will be because you haven't been granted the System Administrator permission. An exact list of functions that are granted to the System Administrator permission but not to the Confluence Administrator permission is available via Atlassian's Confluence documentation. In both cases, you will not have direct access to content that has not explicitly been given to you via space permissions or page restrictions. However, there are ways around this in both cases, which we will explore now. Let's consider the implications of the Confluence administration permissions. We have seen that members of the super users group, Confluence administrators, are able to access all content throughout Confluence regardless of space permissions or restrictions added to pages. This means that if your Confluence instance contains sensitive information, members of the Confluence administrators group will be able to access that content. So, what you should do in this case is limit the number of people who have membership in this group. As we just noted, however, users who have either the Confluence Administrator permission or the System Administrator permission can also easily get access to all content in Confluence. It's important to understand what users with these permissions can and cannot do. Let's start with the Confluence Administrator global permission. Users that have the Confluence Administrator global permission can manage users, groups, and global permissions. They can add users to groups and they can manage global permissions. Is this aspect of their abilities a security concern? Can a user with the Confluence Administrator permission add themselves to the Confluence Administrators group and in that way access all content regardless of restrictions? In fact, users with just the Confluence Administrator permission and not the System Administrator permission cannot manage or delete any group that has been granted System Administrator permissions. They also cannot manage or update the Confluence Administrators group, so they are not able to grant themselves or any group System Administrator permission. For this reason, it is not possible for users with Confluence Administrator global permission to grant themselves or any other user more global administrative permissions than they should have. However, there is a way that they can access all content, which we will talk about when we get to spaces. Now, let's look at the System Administrator permission. Users who have the system administrator permission can easily grant themselves more administrative access than you might have intended. How? They can add themselves to the Confluence Administrators Supergroup. This will grant them access to all content regardless of space permissions or content restrictions. Of course, all of these actions are recorded in the system audit, but you should be aware of the implications of granting users the System Administrator Global Permission. That's it for global permissions. Now let's talk about space permissions. Each space in Confluence has its own set of permissions, which can be granted and revoked by a space administrator. Here are the space level permissions as they are displayed in the Space Permissions Administration panel. As you can see, when reading from left to right, the first permission is the permission to view content. Then we have permissions that grant users, groups, or anonymous users the ability to add or delete pages, blogs, attachments, or comments. Then there are permissions that grant users the ability to add or remove, view or edit restrictions on pages and blog posts. Next, there are mail-related permissions. And finally, there are general space-related permissions, which give users the ability to export or administer the space. Let's look at these permissions in more detail. First, let's consider the All section of the space permissions, which you see appear first on the left in the list of space permissions, where we have View and Delete own options. What does it mean if a user is granted these permissions? If you are in a group or you're a user with view permissions in a space, you can access that space and access content in that space. You'll also see the space in the space directory, and you'll see it in various places in the Confluence interface, such as in the dashboard. If there are any view restrictions applied to individual pages, then that will impact your ability to access those pages or blogs. With the view space permission, the important thing to know is that you'll be able to view the space. Your ability to interact with content in the space will be controlled by other space permissions. If you have been granted the delete own permission, you can delete any pages, blogs, attachments, and comments that you've created in a space. It's important to know, however, that if you do not have the delete permission in pages, blogs, attachments, or comments, you will not be able to delete these types of content created by others. We'll explain this now. Here, we can see only the user's admin and Barbara Windsor are able to access this space. They both have view all permissions. Both users can add pages, and they both have the delete own permission. However, since Barbara does not have any other delete permissions, she cannot delete pages, she cannot delete blogs, she cannot delete attachments in the space unless she created them. If you want to carefully restrict the content that can be removed, do not grant users any delete permissions. The next set of space permissions is very straightforward. You can control users' ability to interact with content in Confluence by managing the add or delete permissions for pages, blogs, and comments. Let's look at a less obvious space permission next. Users can be granted the delete mail permission on a space-by-space basis. But what does this mean exactly? Well, this is a feature of Confluence that is not used very often. Delete Mail grants users the ability to delete mail items that have been archived in the space. And what does that mean? In Confluence, you can collect and archive mail in a space. This is a rarely used feature of Confluence, but it's covered here so that you have a complete understanding of all the information relating to space permissions. Say, for example, you have a space to manage your Teams in Space client project. It might be useful to collect emails that relate to that client project. You can download mail from one or more POP or IMAP accounts, or you can import the mail from an inbox file on your local system or Confluence server. If you want to use the Confluence mail archiving feature, you must make sure that mail options are enabled. To enable the mail archiving features in Confluence, you should access the Manage Apps area of Confluence Administration, then choose System in the drop-down and enable the Confluence mail archiving plugins. When this is enabled, you can manage the import of mail on a space-by-space basis, providing, of course, that you have the space admin permissions for the space. You'll manage mail import from the Integrations area of Space Admin. The next set of space permissions relates to administering and exporting spaces. The space admin permission grants users permission to administer all aspects of the space. If you create a space, you'll automatically be an administrator for that space. As a space administrator, you can grant users, groups, and anonymous users permissions in a space, and you can configure many other administration settings. Users with the export permission for a space have the ability to export space content as XML and HTML. A useful thing to know is that if a user cannot view a page because view page restrictions have been applied to it, that page will not get exported either. Note that users do not need space admin permissions to export a space. If the user has view space permissions and export space permission, they will be able to export all the content that they have access to. The final set of space permissions is the add delete restrictions permission. The add delete permission grants users the permission to add or delete restrictions on pages and blog posts. So if you don't want users to be able to restrict content in your space, do not grant users or groups of users the permission to do so. This brings us quite neatly to the final area of managing permissions, page restrictions. Here, we discuss restrictions at the content level as applied to pages and their children. In Confluence, it's possible to restrict the viewing or editing of pages. Users who have been granted the add delete restrictions space permissions can limit the users and groups that are able to view a page or edit a page. Here, we have the add restrictions dialog box for a page. The page itself is only visible to the user named admin. Everyone else has no access. There is an important point to understand when we talk about the view and edit restrictions on a page, and that is inheritance. Here you can see that we have two page hierarchies. On the left, we have a view restriction applied to a parent page. The child pages inherit the view restrictions. Inheritance works directly for edit restrictions. On the right side, we have an edit restriction applied to a parent page. The child pages do not inherit the edit restrictions. So child pages inherit view restrictions, but they do not inherit edit restrictions. As an administrator, you should know about the ancestor table. Ancestor table issues can cause pages to have the incorrect restriction applied. A user might find that they have permission to access a page but cannot access it. The ancestor table records the parent and descendant, or child, relationship between pages. It is also used when determining whether a page will inherit view restrictions from a parent page. Occasionally, records in the ancestor table can become corrupted. The Repair the Ancestors Table scheduled job finds and automatically fixes problems in the ancestors table in all current spaces. The job runs daily. Sometimes the ancestor table needs to be rebuilt manually. To rebuild the ancestor table manually, go to the General Configuration Admin section and select Scheduled Jobs. Then locate the Repair the Ancestors Table job and choose Run. Let's look at an example of edit restrictions. We'll look at the way edit restrictions impact users' access to a page. We're going to look at a page named Snacks in the Entertainment space. There are no page restrictions applied to the home page, which is Snacks' parent page, so no view restrictions are inherited. Tori and Arjun have applied edit restrictions to the Snacks page. They are the only two users who can edit the Snacks page right now. First, let's consider who can view the Snacks page. To do that, we need to consider who can access the entertainment space. We'll start with the global permissions. As a prerequisite to accessing a space at all, users must have the Can Use global permission. All of the entertainment team belong to either the Confluence users group or the Confluence administrators group, so they have the Can Use global permission. Depending on space permissions, they can access the entertainment space. Access to the entertainment space is granted to the entertainment team and entertainment managers group. It is also granted to an individual user named admin. And of course, we mustn't forget that members of the Confluence administrators group will be able to view content in all spaces regardless of space permissions or space restrictions, because they can view all content in Confluence by default. Now we control what users can do in the space via space permissions. In the entertainment space, members of the entertainment team group are granted all space permissions except add delete restrictions, mail delete, and space export and admin. The entertainment managers group are granted all space permissions without exception as shown. Additionally, an individual user named admin has all space permissions as well. And remember, by default, and without any further configuration, any member of the supergroup Confluence administrators can automatically view all of the content in the space. Let's look at how the global and space permissions work together with page restrictions. Here again, we have the snacks page in the entertainment space. Tori and Arjun have restricted the page so only they can edit it. There are no view restrictions applied to the snacks page, and it doesn't inherit any restrictions from the home page. So at this point, who can view the page? We know that all of the users here are able to access Confluence. Their ability to do things with the content in the entertainment space is managed by permissions managed at the space level. Everyone in the entertainment team group, the entertainment managers group, and the user named admin can access the space because they have the view space permission. Also, any member of the group named Confluence administrators can view any content in this space. All of these users can view the snacks page. Edit restrictions are applied to the snacks page so that only Tori and Arjun can edit it. So what does the edit restriction mean? How does it affect how users can interact with the page? Tori and Arjun have added edit restrictions to the page. This means, of course, that they can edit it, but that no one else can, or at least you might think that is the case, but we'll explore that in a second. Tori and Arjun can add child pages to the page hierarchy where the snacks page sits, delete the snacks page, add or delete attachments to the page, add or delete comments to the page, add or remove restrictions to the page. And what about the other members of the Entertainment Managers group? Like Aliza. Aliza is in the Entertainment Managers group, and she hasn't been given edit permissions for the page. So she can view the snacks page like all the other users in the entertainment space. She can add child pages to the page hierarchy where the snacks page sits, and she can delete the snacks page. She can add comments to the page and delete them. But she cannot directly edit the snacks page or add attachments to it. However, since she's a member of the Entertainment Managers group, she has the permission to add delete restrictions. And she also has space admin permissions. This means that she can access the page, click on the restrictions icon, and add herself to the list of people who can edit the page and manage the page restrictions. Interesting. And Angie is the admin user. She has all of the space permissions, so her interactions with the page will be the same as Aliza. Although she cannot directly edit the snacks page or add attachments to it, she can access the page. Click on the restrictions icon and add herself to the list of people who can edit the page and manage the page restrictions. What about the members of the entertainment team group? They have slightly different permissions. None of the members of this group, like Leo and Raul shown here, have the edit page restrictions for the snacks page. Because of the edit restrictions, they are not able to edit the page, delete the page, nor add or delete attachments on the page. As far as space permissions, they have all of them apart from space export and admin and add delete restrictions. So, unlike Aliza and Angie, they cannot add themselves in order to edit and manage restrictions on the snacks page. And what about members of the Confluence administrators group? Membership in this special group means that they can view all content throughout Confluence, but how can they interact with the snacks page that has the edit restriction applied to it? Barbara is a member of the Confluence administrators group. She can view the snacks page like all other users in the entertainment space, but she cannot edit it directly. She cannot add an attachment or delete an attachment. She can add child pages to the page hierarchy where the snacks page sits, and she can delete the snacks page. She can add comments to the page and delete them. She can delete the page, and she can manage page restrictions. So although she is not able to edit the page directly, she is able to manage her own access to the page by updating page restrictions and adding her name to the list of people who can edit the page. And this brings us back to inheritance. What happens if any of the users who can access the entertainment space create a new page in the space hierarchy that sits as a child under the snacks page? The newly created page, named Potato Chips, does not inherit the edit restrictions. Space permissions interact with this page as expected. as there are no edit restrictions applied. Next, we'll look at a few permissions considerations that are good to know. In Confluence, every newly created space has a set of predefined space permissions. These are managed via the default space permissions administration area in Confluence. This should be reviewed as soon as you set up your Confluence instance. By default, it grants several space permissions to members of the Confluence users group as follows: view and delete own, add pages, blogs, attachments, comments, and export space permissions. This means that unless you update the space permissions default settings, every user that is added or invited to Confluence will also automatically be granted all of these permissions in every new space that is created. This has the impact of potentially giving a user access to content that they shouldn't access. So how can you guard against this? In order to limit the potential of giving out too many permissions for newly created spaces, you could remove the Confluence users group so that they do not have default permissions for all newly created spaces. Instead, replace this group with a group named, for example, Space Admin, as we have here at point 2. Then add a limited number of power users to this group. They can assist in managing spaces as they are being created. Note that any changes to the default space permissions will not be applied to existing spaces. They will only be applied to newly created spaces. And while we're talking about default space permissions, let's talk about something that administrators can do from the default space permissions administration panels, which could present a security risk. We alluded to this earlier, where we talked about the Confluence administrator permission and access to content. As we know, members of the Confluence Administrators Group can access all content regardless of permissions or restrictions. Users with the System Administrator Global Permission can add themselves to the Confluence Administrators Group, and then they can access all content regardless of permissions or restrictions. It is also possible for any user with Global Administration permissions to grant themselves all permissions for a space, including Space Admin. This feature is in place to assist in the event of users accidentally removing themselves from the Space Admin permission. Administrators can access the Space Permissions Administration panel, where default space permissions are managed. Administrators select the Recover Permissions option, and they are reminded that their action is being logged. If the administrator decides to recover permissions, they will be granted all space permissions. Now that they have Space Admin permissions for the space, users can then access the Restricted Pages area of Space Permissions. They can click the lock that you see on the right hand of the image. All page restrictions will be removed, and the user now has full access to the page. The takeaway here is that it's quite difficult to stop users with any level of administrative global permission from accessing any content in Confluence, regardless of space permissions or content restrictions. Now that we've covered global, space, and content level permissions, let's consider how they will all work together. Let's look at the big picture. Let's see how these permissions actually work. In Confluence, there is a hierarchy of permission checking for an individual user. We need Erica to be able to access the incentives page in the HR workspace. In order to access any content at all in Confluence, she must have the Can Use Global Permission. Then she needs to have view permissions for the HR space at a minimum, since she only needs to view access to the content. And then she needs to be able to access the page. In order to access the page, either there must be no view restrictions applied, or she must be excluded from any view restrictions. If Erica has the Can Use Global Permission, the View Space Permission, and view access to the page, then yes, she can view the incentives page in the HR space. Let's recap. Erica is a member of the Confluence users group. As you can see, she has the Can Use Global Permission because she's a member of the Confluence users group. As a member of that group, she has the correct space permissions. And finally, she can access the page as she's one of the users who's been specified as a viewer of the page. What other considerations are there around permissions in Confluence? Permissions are additive. In the space shown, Erica is a member of the Confluence users group, yet she is able to perform all space functions including administration. Let's see how. As a member of Confluence users group, Erica has access to the space. As a member of that group, she can view content. And that's all. The group doesn't have any other permissions. However, Erica has been given individual access to view the space and has been granted every other space permission. Be aware that a user can belong to one group that doesn't have all space permissions, but if they are given other permissions, either via individual access or from membership in a different group, then the wider set of permissions will prevail. As we've already discussed, you can enable anonymous user access to your Confluence site by granting the can use permission to anonymous users. There is no license cost for these users. This is a bonus, of course, if you have a lot of content to share with many users. A common use case for this is sharing product documentation by allowing anonymous access to a space. If your Confluence instance contains highly sensitive information, however, the best option would be to refrain from granting anonymous users the can use global permission. If you still need to use Confluence to share content publicly, you could consider having one Confluence instance that sits behind the firewall for organization-only access to the content, and then a separate Confluence instance that is accessible from outside of your organization and used specifically for sharing documentation. As we discussed earlier, the global permissions for anonymous users are slightly different to those granted to users with a Confluence account. We'll look at some things to consider when dealing with anonymous access next. There is a minimum set of permissions needed to give anonymous users access to a space in Confluence. First, they need to be granted can use global permission, and secondly, they need to be granted view space permission. Anonymous users won't be able to access any content until they've been given access on a space-by-space basis via space permissions. In order to make your instance as secure as possible, you should limit anonymous users' permissions so that they can access only the minimum amount of content. Here, we've given anonymous users access to our Confluence instance, but they are only allowed view access for one space, the DocuSpace, and we've limited access to view only. They cannot add, delete, restrict, or export content, and they cannot administer the space. As an administrator of Confluence, you might be concerned that once anonymous access is allowed via global permissions, an inexperienced space administrator might give too much access to the space and grant anonymous users all of the space permissions, including space admin. However, it is not possible to do so. Even if you selected all of the possible space permissions to grant to anonymous users as you see in the first image, you'll find that the add-delete restrictions and space admin permissions will not be checked, as you can see in the second image. The bottom line here is that you can give anonymous users the permission to export the space. It is also possible to grant anonymous users the permissions to add or delete pages, blogs, attachments, and comments, but you cannot give an anonymous user space admin or add-delete restriction permissions. Having open space permissions is something that you should grant very carefully. Content in spaces where anonymous users are granted all of the space permissions must be checked and managed carefully, as anyone can create, edit, or delete content in that space. All content will be attributed to anonymous users, so there's a large element of trust involved and no accountability or traceability. You should now have a detailed understanding of how we can configure Confluence permissions. You'll now be fully prepared to look at some configuration use cases and some troubleshooting scenarios.